Night falls on a busy quay, and a rat slips from a sack of grain. No thunder, no omen, just a flea with a job to do. Within weeks, bells toll from Genoa to London. Within months, wages speak louder than lords. Tonight we tell the Black Death as a story of movement, money, and memory. How a microbe rode trade routes, how cities learned to count the sick to save the living, and how labor rewrote its contract with power. Our through question is simple and stubborn. When fear travels faster than fact, who keeps time? Ports, priests, or paymasters? And why did Europe look different the morning after? Well, follow three working machines. First, logistics, ships, pack roads, and markets that turned fleas into timetables. Second, institutions, quarantine, bills of mortality, parish books, the dull paperwork that invented public health. Third, economics, empty fields, rising wages, guild rules bending, land changing hands. Three recurring voices will ground us: a Venetian notary who counts the dead and the debts, a London bellman who learns to read the weekly bills, and a Flemish weaver whose wage buys, for the first time, a say. Well, move from Messina's harbour to English churchyards, from plague pits to statutes of labourers, from the first 40-day quarantiner to the idea that data can calm a city. No gore, no sensationalism, just how a continent learned to measure a crisis and how those measures never quite went away. If history told with receipts, roads, and real choices works for you, settle in. This will be long, clear, and useful. The first part. The ship from the east did not look like a prophecy. She came low in the water, canvas tired, a crossbow bolt still stuck in her stern post from some argument far away. When she bumped the mole at Messina in 1347, rats moved first. A dock clerk counting sacks figs, grain, will watched a grey shape pour down the hawser-like liquid and vanish between timbers. No bell rang for that. Bells rang later. Our Venetian notary hears about the ship the way money hears, from a factor's letter that smells like tar. Cargo distressed, crew sick, please honour drafts. It says in clean mercantile Latin. The notary folds the letter twice and traces a line on a map with his thumbnail. Theodosia on the Black Sea. The Genoese called it Caffa. The Bosporus, the islands, Messina. Then up the Tyrrhenian to the mouths that feed Florence and Pisa. Trade looks like veins when you squint. He doesn't yet know that a flea's mouth has joined the network. Terms so your ear stays sure. The germ here is Yersinia pestis. It rides in the blood of small mammals. Black rats ratters share our ships and ceilings. A flea takes infected blood. The germ grows in its gut. The gut clogs. The flea bites again and regurgitates infection into whatever warm thing it finds. You do not need to memorize the Latin to feel the timetable. Food arrives, flea feeds, fever follows. Ports turn biology into schedule. A scene on the Black Sea a season earlier, because rumor needs an origin. Outside the walls of Caffa, an army coughs inside the walls. Merchants count time. A later story says the besiegers hurled corpses over the walls and invented biological war. Scholars debate the details. Siege engines, certainly through many things, and disease certainly ran faster than men. What matters for our hour is simpler. Ships full of people who had lived in a breathing, cramped city under stress untied, court-wined, and carried more than cloth and silver. Much history is an accident powered by routine. Numbers that hold. A round trip from the Black Sea to Sicily might take weeks in good weather. A flea does not need weeks. Mortality in the first European wave will average 1 in 3 to 1 in 2. Worse in tight, hungry places, lighter on scattered farms. Those are cruel averages. No one lives an average. In one parish a bell will swing until the clapper breaks. In the next a single household will light the candles and wait in a quiet street. Our London bellman has not yet been born to learn the weekly bills. He will come later, when people have learned to make lists of the dead as a way of calming the living. For now, bells are information without numbers, loud, local, and confusing. In Messina, they toll enough to sound like wind through iron. In Venice, The notary steps into a fondaco courtyard, the exchange yard, and sees men argue over credit terms because fear has raised the price of time. Myth, trimmed and tagged. The Black Death is sometimes told as if it arrived once and left. It did not. It came in a hard first wave, 13471353, and then returned for centuries, lighter or sharper by region and year. It is sometimes told as if medieval people believed only in sign and miasma. Many also observed patterns and acted on them. Closing gates, stopping markets, isolating ships, cleaning streets, counting burials. Fear and method can live in the same hour. Bring in the Flemish weaver, because wages will begin to speak, even now. He is a boy in 1347, sweeping a shop. He has heard that ships mean cloth sales. He has not heard that empty houses will make his hands expensive. For the moment, he counts warps and listens to older men mutter about wool from England and dyes from Italy and a rumor of sickness far south that makes deliveries late. Delay is already money. Ports turn rumor into rules. In Ragusa Dubrovnik, 3 decades from this first wave, councils will write a clear line. Newcomers from infected places must wait outside the walls for a set number of days before entering. The number will settle at 40 quarantine long enough to outweigh the obvious disease. Venice will go further in the 15th century. Lazarettos on islands, bills of health, cordons on the water. None of that exists in Messina today. What exists is a dock clerk's nose for trouble and masters who swear that their cargo must unload now because creditors do not accept prayers. Close scene. A quayside without paperwork, but alive with decisions. A magistrate hears complaints. Sailors feverish. A baker's apprentice who fell asleep at the oven and never woke. A priest who says the city must process the icon and the reliquary. A merchant who says the port must not stop. The magistrate does the oldest thing a city can do. He sets a rule for tomorrow morning because tonight is already broken. Unload grain, no passengers ashore, ships to anchor outside the mole by dawn. It is thin protection, but protection begins as thin lines that can be thickened later. Numbers again, useful in the ear. A quay can unload a few hundred tons in a busy day. A rat can cross a rope in seconds. A merchant can survive a 20-day delay. If lenders agree, a day of panic can destroy a season's plan. Fleas do not negotiate. People must. Our Venetian notary drafts a clause for a contract that seems minor and will become a habit. Force majeure acts beyond rational control do not void the promise, they pause it. He counts days, adds penalties, specifies that a ship must wait at anchor if distemper rides in the city. He thinks about faith and law and decides that a fine posted in advance can replace a miracle not guaranteed to arrive. That is how modernity really starts in Mogens, where people stop demanding the weather's consent. A narrow bridge forward, so you hear where we are going. In a year, this sickness will have struck ports around the Tyrrhenian and the Channel. In 2, it will have pushed inland along roads that always smelled of mule and wine. In 3, a weaver in Flanders will appraise his own hands differently because there are fewer hands around him. In a few decades, councils will enclose islands and invent the 40-day rule in a few centuries. A London bellman will read weekly bills aloud, while a man named John Grant learns to make a table out of death and turn panic into trend. We will meet them all. For now, stand on the Messina mole at dusk, watch the last boat pull a sick man back to a ship he should never have left, and listen to rats do what rats always do where grain meets rope and the wind forgets to care. Why this matters tomorrow. If a city is a promise to keep strangers predictable, plague attacks the promise first. Ports must answer faster than fear. Rules at the quay, rooms to wait, granaries that open, streets that close, and a way anyway to count. Counting is not an epitaph, it is a lever. The second part. Fear learned to stand in line. Word from Messina ran up the Italian coast like weather, and governments did what frightened people do when they have clipboards. They wrote time into law. In the hill city of Siena, the council decreed that gravediggers be paid and streets limed in Florence. Doors were chalked in Milan. A few entire houses were bricked shut with the living and the sick together, a cruelty that stopped some chains and made other kinds of grief. But the rule that would outlive the century took shape on the Dalmatian coast. Ragusa Dubrovnik held its council in a stone room that knew the sea by taste. The city lived on transits, Adriatic pilots, Balkan caravans, warehouses tidy enough to make Venice nervous. In the summer of 1377, after 3 hard decades of waves and lulls, the councillors wrote a sentence plain enough to travel. Newcomers from infected places must wait on the islands before entering, for a set number of days. At first 30 Trentino, soon 40 Quarantina. Not a charm, an interval. Make time do the policing that people could not. Our Venetian notary copies a version of the rule into a trade booklet with other useful sentences, exchange rates, St. days to avoid for shipping, a note about crosswinds in the straits, 40 days outside. He writes in a margin next to the names of 2 small spits of rock where tents already dot the scrub. He adds a clause to a contract. Goods may be delivered to the lazaretto for inspection. Payment follows clean entry. He's not thinking about microbes. He's thinking about promises that can survive interruptions. Terms: clean so the ear keeps trust. Lazaretto, a place of waiting and inspection. Later a whole complex on its own island. Bills of health, letters a ship brings from its last port, claiming clean or suspect. Sanitary cordon, a line of soldiers and posts that turn a town's boundary into a fence for bodies, not ideas. Ragusa made the habit, Venice made the architecture. By 1423, the Serenissima will turn an island into the Lazaretto Vecchio, a permanent waiting room surrounded by water, a moat against chance. Close scene on the lagoon a half-century later, because you need to see the rule-wearing stone. Dawn pushes pearl light through the marsh, the notary older now. Slower steps from a workboat onto a low quay, where a clerk with a wax board reads ship names from a honink list. The air smells of vinegar and seaweed. Bales are lifted with hooks into courtyards, where smoke curls from braziers cloth. His aired paperwork is aired with it. A priest walks a lane to bless none of this. He carries a bucket and a ladle. He's part of the system that washes hands and tools and thresholds. Fear has been turned into chores. Numbers that hold the year without boasting. 40 days is long enough to outwait the fevers people can see, but long enough to destroy trade. A lazaretto can handle a handful of ships at a time. The sea gives you capacity, whether you like it or not. A cordon around a town posts a bowshot apart. Men who can count shifts will count days. Every figure is a compromise between caution and hunger. Myth, trimmed and tagged. We like to say they believed in miasma, as if that ends the story. Many did believe air could sicken. Many also noticed patterns, contact, rooms, cloth, and acted on them with the tools they had. Intervals, islands, lists, controlled fires, vinegar, fees. The modern word isn't faith or science, it's procedure. The Renaissance did not invent it. Frightened magistrates did. Bring in our Flemish weaver as the waiting rule meets wages. In the 1350s and 1360s, long before Ragusan paperwork becomes famous, empty looms already teach math. Fewer hands mean a day's hand is dearer. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 1351, try to cap wages at old levels. Courts fine those who hire too high. In Flanders, guilds relax entry rules they swore were sacred, because work that doesn't ship is in a sack of nothing. The weaver's master dies in one bad week. The boy's hands become a bargain he can make. He buys shoes, he buys a voice. A scene in London a lifetime later, because counting becomes a civic habit. Plague will not leave Europe, or will revisit. In the early 1600s, weekly bills of mortality appear in London. Parish clerks count burials. Messengers total them. Printers set the numbers. A bellman reads them in the street. Our bellman learns to grade danger by digits. In 1662, a curious man named John Grant will read those bills like a ledger, find patterns in christenings and burials, and write a little book that invents demography. All of that grows from the same impulse that built islands for waiting, fear, forced to behave, tie islands to inland, so stakes land. A quarantiner at the harbour buys time for carts on the road to make detours, for granaries to open and keep a market calm, for city gates to choose hours, for parish clerks to plan graves. It also buys time for gossip to calm intervals. Nothing spreads like a rumour in a town with no numbers. Nothing slows, as well as a decree with a date and a fee. Terms again, useful. Penance processions. Flagellants will walk Europe during early waves. Authorities sometimes ban them, because parades of close bodies are exactly what disease wants. Pest house, a rough hospital out at the edge. Better than nothing and often not much better. Bills of health, eventually stamped by reputable ports, forged by desperate captains, audited by men who know the smell of truth. Fumigation in this era means smoke and vinegar. It also means giving fear something to do with its hands. While time passes, our notary writes a different kind of clause in a will, because grief also learns procedure. I leave to the Scuola di San Rocco a lay brotherhood that tends the sick 3 ducats to buy oil and vinegar for the poor quarantined. He writes quarantined without thinking the word new. He has lived long enough to watch a habit settle into language. Numbers, 1 cold set. Mortality rates in Venice's bad year may touch 1 in 3 in Ragusa. They might be lower, because fewer ships force patients in Milan. They may be sharply divided house by house, because walls become boundaries for breath. Statutes that cap wages fail, and are reissued, a sign of a market that refuses to obey a sentence. Grain prices wobble and changes hands. Dow portions shift. A weaver's daughter marries into a family that would not have seen him last year. This is economics with funerals and its moduns. Bring in the bellman's first small stake, even before he is born. He is the child of a church sexton. He will learn numbers by steps between graves. When the bills arrive, the city will pay him to shout them, and he will discover the peculiar comfort of a list. Between the plague pits of 1349 and his voice in 1603 stands a long apprenticeship. Quarantines on islands, cordons on roads, officials who nail paper to doors, parish clerks who total names. A continent learns that arithmetic is a public good, a small correction to movie habits. Plague is not a single rushing wall, it is a weather made of many fronts. Some are local and sharp, some are slow and everywhere. Heroes do little against it except keep records, feed neighbors, clean drains, and invent waiting. Those acts do not look like drama until you count how many lives they buy. One last image before we move to the ledger and the pit. On the lagoon, a boy leans over the lazaretto wall and watches a skiff bring bread to men who cannot step ashore. On the Dalmatian rock, to merchants under a wine-torn awning play a game with beans and a board to kill an hour that has 40 days in it. In Flanders a weaver's shuttle pauses as a thought crosses a face. Tomorrow he will ask for a better rate. Fear has been given length, and in that length wages will find voice. Why this matters tomorrow. Every crisis teaches one durable trick. Plague's trick was to turn time itself into a tall 40 days, printed bills, a weekly rhythm of counting, and to let ordinary people act on schedules instead of omens. That is the real beginning of public health, not a cure, a calendar. The third part. The ledger learned a new column. In the winter of 134,849, our Venetian notary sits under a courtyard arch, breath-smoking, and copies will after will. The formula barely changes. Pious bequests, a debt forgiven, a dowry secured, but the age is due. Old men, yes, but also masters in their 30s, apprentices, midwives, sailors who owned a sixth of a whole, widows who suddenly carry 3 keys. Between the lines a city's ownership map redraws itself at speed. What fire does in a night, plague does over a season. It transfers time. He notices another pattern. Witnesses are scarce, scribes overworked, executors younger. He begins to write clearer dates, fuller descriptions of houses, better lists of tools, not piety, prevention of lawsuits. When a third of your neighbors disappear, vagueness is war. In his margin, he invents a habit, a tiny mark beside wills that involve a craft shop, a second mark where the widow now owns the bench. Later, taxmen will thank him for thinking ahead. Across the channel, England does its own math. Fields lie uncut in some parishes in others. Harvest comes late under a new crew that began the season as cowherds and finished it as reapers. Wages lift where hands thin. In London the Crown reads reports of excessive pay, panics for order, and issues the Ordinance 1349. Then the Statute of Labourers 1351. No worker shall take more than pre-plague wages, no employer shall pay more, idlers must work. Courts fill, fines are posted, the market shrugs. Where food rots, law cannot keep a price tied to yesterday. Our Flemish weaver steps into this light, with dust on his sleeves, and a mouth suddenly worth money. He is apprenticed as a loom, whose owner failed to wake. A cousin inherits the frame, and cannot fill orders alone. You tie the warp, the boy says. He'll beat the weft, we split better than before. He asks for coin and bread, and for the first time, he is not laughed out of the doorway. Guild elders, faced with empty benches, loosen rules they once called eternal. Shorter apprenticeships, more masters per alley. Women taking work home to finish weft while children sleep. Principles bend in the direction of hunger. Terms so the year stays sure. Harriet, a death duty paid in the best beast or equivalent suddenly owed often. Suddenly negotiable. Copyhold, customary rights to use land recorded in manorial rolls. Those rolls bulge with transfers. Mortmain dead hand laws that keep church lands from swelling to fast renewed and argued, because bequests rise when fear sits at the table. These dry words are how grief becomes a new map. Numbers that hold without swagger. In parts of England and the Low Countries, farm wages can rise by half in the worst years in cities. Skilled hands sometimes double their day rate for a while. Rents soften, diets harden, in a good sense more meat, better ale, slightly longer candles in winter. Not everywhere, not forever. In regions trampled by troops, or with rulers who clamp hard, gains vanish or turn to revolt. Averages help councils, households live in specifics. Myth, trimmed and tagged. The plague created the middle class is a sentence tidy enough to dislike. What we can say cleanly: mortality made labour scarce, scarcity raised labour's price. Statutes tried to pin wages, many failed. Status lines blurred in some places. Bargaining power formed that had been impossible a decade earlier. Add weather, war, and taxes, and you get a map of outcomes that looks like river braids, not a straight canal. The notary copies a contract between a ship owner and 4 heirs whose uncle died in a fortnight. 1/8 of the hull, he writes, splitting shares at paying grain and pepper when ships return. He adds a clause he has used before. If plague prevents attendance at the quay on due day, payment will be made at the convent gate on the following market day, witnessed by Brother Parlour. Seal to be broken in the presence of 2 clerks. When bodies are uncertain, you pin promises 2 places. A scene in a parish yard, because economics has a shovel. Carters tip a load into a long trench, a priest murmurs fast and steady lime necklaces the edges. On a board, a clerk scratches marks lines of 5 and a note. Wife and sister both beside one line. Apprentice of Pietro found by door beside another. This is not morbid bookkeeping, it is the start of memory. News later, who owes what? Who had pledged to whom? Who has a claim on it all? A lease, a dowry. A city that buries fast must still remember straight. Numbers again, colder. In some Venetian sestieri, household counts drop by a third. In Messina's fiscal registers, whole blocks go thin, then refill with new names within a decade. In the cloth towns, looms per street fall, then climb, but not always back to the same families. In England, attempts to enforce wage caps produce court rolls full of fines that, in practice, look like a tax on hiring. That tax funds sheriffs who read out statutes that markets ignore, and teaches governments a lesson they will never quite forget. Decrees without data die. Bring the bellman into earshot, even out of time, because his habits will explain this chapter. He stands at a corner to centuries later and reads the weekly bills, numbers of burials per parish aloud. Men at doorways nod or go pale. John Grant, listening, will notice that the numbers rise and fall with a rhythm. Plague year spiking, consumption steady. Christenings telling him something about famine the previous spring. He will make a table and, without knowing our notary, will join his instinct, grief with counts, fear with columns. Between them lies a strand of continuity that begins here, with clerks scratching beside a trench. A narrow religious note, kept useful. Processions come and go, the flagellant bands arrive, and are sometimes banned, because close bodies in motion make numbers worse. Confraternities, the squall quietly expand. Lay groups that nurse the sick, endow chapels, maintain lists of who needs bread on Thursday. The church's answer is not only prayer, it is roster. The roster outlives panic. Our weaver buys a pair of shoes, a stout belt, and a wooden spoon with his name carved on it. Small things, but they say, "This wage is mine." He also pays a penny to a guild box that will feed him as the looms fall silent again. Precautions multiply. City walls keep carts waiting for a day when word of fever runs ahead, pest houses sprout at edges, markets move outdoors, funerals shorten, weddings hurry. People are not wiser, they are trained by repetition. Tie pit to purse, so stakes land. If a master dies without a will, his tools can rot in a locked shop. As the notary arrives, inventory turns iron into food. If a manor holds a Harriet harshly, sons flee if it forgives, fields get planted. If a council insists on the old wage, bread lies unsold. If it allows the new, bread moves and rules look legitimate. None of this is theory. You can taste it in the morning. One scene of enforcement, because statutes do more than flutter. In an English market town, a reeve posts a notice: "No man shall pay above the ancient rate on pain of fine." 2 weeks later, he hires a thatcher above the rate, because his own roof leaks. The thatcher gets fined, the reeve pays grudgingly, and calls it God's will. The fine goes to the sheriff, who buys ink to copy more fines. Everyone learns the difference between law and capacity. Myth. One last trimless chapter. Cities did not become clean or scientific overnight. Many learned nothing they could keep. Others learned one habit and kept it. Count, post, enforce where you can, adjust where you must, and write things down so next time you start an hour closer to sense. That is not romantic. It is how people survive. One last image before we cross to London and the sound of numbers. In Venice, the notary sands a line dry and presses a seal, satisfied that a widow will eat. In Flanders, a loom stops with a loud, neat clack, and the weaver stretches his back, thinking not of death, but of dye. In a parish yard, the clerk closes his list and notes in the margin a small business, spoon name cut keep for child. Between trench and bench, a continent learns to turn loss into records and records into rights. The fourth part. London learned to hear numbers. Long after the first great wave crossed Europe, plague still came and went like bad weather, and the city by the Thames decided to make weather reports. Parish clerks counted burials each week, messengers gathered the totals, printers set the figures, and on a Friday morning a bellman took a folded sheet, the bills of mortality, and read the counts aloud at corners, where markets began. Panic prefers rumours, the bills offered a rhythm. Close scene, a corner near street. Pause. The bellman clears his throat, taps his staff, and sings the list into the morning. Street. Giles in the Fields, 106. Street. Sepulchre, 84. Street. Alaves, 33. Total burials this week, 3,010. Of the plague, 2,312. Shop shutters pause, a baker stops his peel halfway, a mother squeezes a child's hand. Numbers do not comfort. They do something else. They make strangers share the same sentence. Terms so the year stays sure. Searches, mostly older women appointed to view the dead and report causes plague. Consumption, teeth for infants, aged, suddenly. Parish clerks, the recorders who turn grief into rose. Company of parish clerks, the guild that prints the weekly bills. Pest house, a rough hospital at the Mogens, often funded by a city livery company. Shut-up houses, dwellings where the sick are sealed inside. A blunt tool that catches some chains and creates others. The bills ride above all this like a metronome. How a bellman learns his craft the way a cooper learns staves, by feel. The first year he reads, 1603, the numbers climb until every street sounds like iron and fear. He finds that a steady voice helps neighbors stay neighborly. He discovers that people want the totals, but live by the trend, rising, falling, where, street. Giles High means the west wind carries whirring. Stepney rising means ships in the pool have trouble. He learns to angle his voice in alleys so panic doesn't bounce back. A man stands at the edge of the crowd with a notebook and a curiosity that will become a quiet revolution. John Grant, a London haberdasher with a habit of counting, buys the bills week by week, stacks them, and in 1660 writes natural and political observations on the bills of mortality. He adds columns no one asked for, christenings versus burials, plague versus consumption, seasonal patterns, sex ratios. He notices that some parishes consistently report more deaths even in communes. Perhaps they are larger, perhaps poorer, perhaps both. He calculates that London's population can be inferred from the rhythm of burials. He does not cure anything. He invents a way to see numbers that hold without swagger. A bad London week in 1665 can show more than 7,000 burials. Communes sit near for 100,000, 700 per week. The printed sheet lists causes in familiar, period words griping in the guts, rising of the lights and plague spikes rise like cliffs among them. Grant's tables show christenings falling, while burials rise. He concludes people have fled. The city has learned to hear absence, myth, trimmed and tagged. We like to imagine the bills as precise modern statistics. They are not. Searches guessed, families lied, officials nudged, yet the signal is there. Spikes you cannot mistake, streets you learn to avoid, seasons that teach you when to close the theatre and when to open the market. Imperfect data can still move policy if everyone agrees to read from the same sheet. Bring our other two lives forward so the thread doesn't fray. The Venetian notary is long gone, but his habit turned fear into clauses survives in London orders. Keep carts off narrow lanes on plague days, move markets outdoors, forbid wakes in small rooms, pay searches in coin, not favours. The Flemish weaver's line has crossed the North Sea. Many cloth workers settled in the Dutch towns and in London's Spitalfields. A grandson now runs a frame under a skylight and listens hard for the bellman. When the totals swell, he sends apprentices home in haps, staggers work, stretches warp stock, and carries his guild dues to the churchyard footpath, where the collector meets him in the air. Procedure becomes a city's second spine. Bills at corners, orders now to post pest house carts given right-of-way, dead carts forbidden from market streets before noon, watchmen paid to keep shut-up houses supplied, so desperation doesn't climb out windows at night. Parish to parish transfers of bread money, recorded with a neatness born of repetition. The habit of writing rules down and posting them turns fear from a free agent into a schedule. Close scene, the printer's shop. Compositors set plague in a line. They wish they could retire. An apprentice learns to spell parish names by fingertip. The company clerk checks columns against messengers' totals and scolds a searches mark that reads like palsy when the family swore aged. Ink dry sheets stack runners, carry them to corners where the bellman will turn them back into breath. Around the room hang past weeks, like weather maps rising, falling, stable and early epidemiology in wood and paper. Tie numbers to decisions, so stakes land. The Lord Mayor scans the bills and orders play houses shut. Guild wardens schedule wage payments to avoid crowds. River men stagger shifts at the Paul Parsons rotate funerals. Quarantines 40 days in a pest house or at home become more than superstition. When the sheet says rising in Stepney, the city learns a hard courtesy. Tell the truth aloud on Friday, so Saturday's markets don't turn into a riot. Terms again, useful. Bills of health, letters carried by ships, stating conditions at last port. London learns to ask for them, because the bills taught it to think weekly. Watchers, men posted at infected doors. The city learns to pay them on time, because late pay becomes broken rules. Dead cart, a wagon at night. The city learns to route it, time it, and wash it, because ritual without rinsing is theatre. Our bellman develops a small superstition that is not mystical at all. When he reads slowly, Markets behave when he rushes, rumours sprint. He has learned pacing as a public service. He and the parish clerks, the searches, the printers, the Lord Mayor, and John Grant form an accidental machine. Observation sheet voice order habit. It is ugly and often cruel. It is also the ancestor of every comm chart you have ever trusted. Numbers. One last cluster this chapter. Grant estimates London's population near for 100,000 in comm years from christenings and burials. A guess clever enough that later men will not. He shows at plague burials, though monstrous in spikes, fade consumption lung disease never does an early glimpse that some killers are endemic. He notices that more boys are christened than girls, a fact strangers will argue about for centuries. He points to abortives in the list and wonders privately about women whose lives never made the sheet except as a line in a sad column. Counting breeds compassion in careful minds. A small correction to legend. We remember 1665 for the Great Plague and 1666 for the fire. And we like to say the fire cleansed the city of rats. The next century's returns prove otherwise. Plague does not return at 1665 levels, but the reasons are many quarantines on the river, changing rat habitats, prior immunity, and luck more than a single blaze. The bills keep people honest about what changed and what didn't. Bring the weaver's shop into the policy arc. When the bills fall for 3 weeks running, he calls in apprentices in full, delivers cloth to the exchange, and negotiates for better die, because risk has fallen and demand will rise. When the bills jump, he moves work to 2 houses to avoid crowded breaths, keeps windows pried, and sends one boy to the pest house with bread, because his mother is alone. Labour has learned to read the city the way sailors read wind. One last image before we set the bills aside and look at a household ledger that learned to speak. Dusk. The bellman folds his empty sheet, leans his staff against a post, and listens to the city exhale. In a nearby room, John Grant copies a column into a table and scratches a note in the margin. Some certainty may be had. A printer hangs damp sheets on cords. Like laundry, a searcher warms her hands by a small brazier and rubs vinegar on her palms. A child makes up a counting song with parish names, because that is what children do with fear that has numbers. The city is tired and, for the moment, orderly. Why this matters tomorrow. Before charts and dashboards, cities taught themselves to move in weekly beats. Post, read, adjust, repeat. The miracle is not precision. It is agreement to be guided by a common page. Once you have that, you can stretch it from plague to fire to wages to bread. That is the durable gift of the bills. The 5th part. Bargains make backlashes. After the first hard years, Europe did not heal into yesterday. It learned to live at a different price. Fields reopened with new cruise workshops. Hummed under new names. Councils discovered that posting rules on Fridays helped Mondays behave. And then the bills came due for power itself. Scene Florence, summer 1378. In a dye yard by the Arno, men with blue wrists and tired eyes whisper the math out loud. The chompy, the woolcarders, and day hands at the edge of guild privilege have carried the city through thin seasons. Now they want seats, not alms, a voice in a guild, a say in rates, not just a bowl of soup at the convent gate. Our Flemish weaver, visiting for cloth patterns, watches as a procession turns into a demand, and a demand into a government that lasts months, not years. When it ends with fines and expulsions, not slaughter. But the lesson sticks on both sides. Labour has a voice, power has a memory. Scene England, June 1381. The King's ministers push a poll tax to pay for war sheriffs, push hard villages that buried fathers and paid fines to high reapers now refuse to pay for a census of heads. Men who have seen wages rise will not go back to as before. The peasants' revolt learns London's streets fast, and for a day it looks as if parchment will burn authority clean. It does not. The promises spoken on Smithfield are revoked. The hangman does his work later. But even revoked promises stain. Landlords write subtler contracts. Villanage thins in practice, if not in law, because tenants can walk. Our Venetian notary never writes the word revolt. He writes contracts that look like peace treaties, a ship share divided among more heirs than before, a workshop where a widow holds a bench on condition she pays a journeyman a posted rate, a confraternity endowment that pays for oil and vinegar for the pest house and asks in return for 2 names read aloud on a saint's day. Clerks do not fix the world, but they tilt it toward habits that outlast a shout, numbers that hold. In many towns, day wages for skilled hands remain higher for decades. In others, rents soften, then harden again with new wars and bad weather. In places where statutes tried to freeze yesterday's rates, fines pile up like a second tax. In places where councils published fair rates and adjusted them with seasons, grumbling stayed lower. Revolts, when they came, clustered where law refused to hear the market terms, so the ear stays sure. Sumptuary laws, rules about what each rank may wear, anxious authority trying to pin status when price want, chantry, an endowment that funds prayers and, more practically, lights, bread, and sometimes a school bench. Mortality turned into a budget. Liberty, in charters, a zone of reduced feudal dues sold more often after plague because lords needed coin. Commute, to pay cash instead of labour. Common, where hands could bargain. These dry words are the scaffolding around human grief and stubbornness. Bring our 3 lives forward so the story breathes. The Flemish weaver, now a master, takes an apprentice whose mother signs the indenture herself. Her name on the line would have been rare before. He pays guild dues, grumbles at taxes, and keeps a small box with coins for the next bad year, a habit born under the plague's shadow. The London bellman learns to read more than numbers in faces during a bad week. He slows his voice so a crowd doesn't tilt mean. In Venice, the notary sits before men who ask for a permanent board of health officials with authority over lazarettos, ships, bills of health, and street cleaning. The city will name them magistrates. Their office will outlive them all. Myth, trimmed and kept accurate. The beads plague Dr. Mask belongs to later centuries and to Italy and France more than to England. Use it as a symbol sparingly. The first quarantines are not modern medicine, they are good procedure. Revolts are not born of madness, they are math with grief in it. None of this is a miracle. All of it is people learning what works and what hurts in public. A scene at a city gate, because borders remain where promises are tested. A cart arrives with sacks and a stamped bill of health from a clean port. The watch checks the seal, the weight, the driver's breath, and the fee. The cart moves. Behind it a man with nothing to sell and a cough is told to wait in the outer yard, where a priest with vinegar hands out bread. The bellman's cousin has the watch today. He keeps the line even, not kind. Cities survive by that kind of fairness. Numbers again, modest and useful. 40 days on an island saved many from infection, and some from hunger. A posted Friday bill saved arguments on Saturday. A wage set publicly and revised by season kept the market from becoming a rumor. Revolts killed fewer than plague, but taught longer. Write the promise, pay on time, count together, tie backlashes to bargains so stakes land. When Florence clamps the chompi out of offices, the edges of the craft economy learn to move. Women finish cloth at home. Smaller towns pick up orders. Roads gain whispers. When England kills the leaders of 1381, copyholders and commutations still spread, because lords cannot force men who can walk and be hired elsewhere. When Venice builds a health magistracy, other ports borrow the model with their own seals. Authority that adapts keeps a city. Authority that remembers only how to command loses one street at a time. Our notary, now grey, writes a final habit on the flyleaf of a blank book he will not live to fill. Always ask where the time goes. He means the 40 days, the Friday counts, the hours at the gate, the days between a promise and its pay. He has spent a life taking fear and turning it into intervals and places. That is his theology. One last scene before we step to the coda of what lasted. The weaver locks his shop and hands a loaf to a neighbour whose husband died last week. He knows this isn't charity. It's insurance paid in bread. The bellman reads a com week's small numbers and lets his voice warm because he sees 2 children counting along on their fingers. On a quay, A health magistrate examines a bill with a stain and rejects it. The ship will wait 2 more days, and the clerk will log the choice without drama. This is the unpoetic machinery that let Europe wake up different and live with that difference. Why this matters tomorrow. After the panic comes the price. If you want order without cruelty, publish the numbers, post the intervals, pay the watchers, adjust the rates in daylight, and accept that some status will bend. If you refuse, you will pay later in corners where voices echo too well. The 6th part. States learned to draw lines you could not see but had to obey. After the first century of waves, Italian cities stopped treating plague as weather and began treating it as jurisdiction. Paper multiplied. Health boards with seals bills of health stamped at the key passes that said who could move, and when cordons of men spaced along roads a bowshot apart. Fear, made legible, became a border. Seen Venice, mid-15th century. In a room that smells of ink and brine, 3 magistrates of health sit at a long table. On the wall hangs a city plan peppered with pins. Lazarettos on their islands, quarantine anchorages, routes of scavenger boats, gatehouses, where watchers sit with hourglasses. A clerk reads ship names from a horn-ink list. A boatman waits for a paper that lets him row bread to the lazaretto without being stopped every 50 paces. Our old Venetian notary's habit has outlived him. Clauses and intervals now wear uniforms. Terms, clean so your ear doesn't stumble. Cordon sanitaire, a ring of posts to slow bodies, not thoughts. Health pass fedidi sanit, a stamped line saying you came from a clean place, or that your waiting is complete. Lazaretto Vecchio and Lazaretto Nuovo, the paired islands of Venice, one for the sick, one for the suspect, with yards to air cloth and ledgers to air promises. Monotti Milan, hired carriers of the dead, better paid than loved, proof that logistics decides whether pity becomes policy. Numbers that hold without swagger. Posts on a cordon set within sight call it 200 paces, so a shout carries and a lantern answers at night. 40 days remains the quarantine norm, sometimes bent to 30 when hunger growls. Health boards meet on fixed days, so captains can plan against a calendar instead of a rumor. The point is not perfection, it is predictability. See Milan, 1576. A warm procession of repentance winds toward the Duomo, banners soft as breath. San Carlo Borromeo walks barefoot, shouldering a relic. Crowds press, pray, and, impressing, share. Behind the pageant, the city's health board Tribunal di Sanit keeps duller rhythm. Pest houses stock dead carts, rooted clothes smoked over vinegar passes, issued and rescinded. A century later, in 1630, the rhythm will be harder. Camps on the roads, guards at village limits, markets moved outdoors, suspicion of anointers who supposedly spread disease. Our story refuses scapegoats. What helps is procedure, spacing bodies, timing errands, paying watchers. Bring our 3 lives forward in new hands. The notary's apprentice is now a health board scribe. He writes fines for men who broke quarantine to fetch a rope or a kiss. He also writes remissions for widows who missed a deadline, because a gate shut early mercy is a Schedule 2. The Flemish weaver, now a greymaster, learns to carry a health pass between towns when cloth must move during a bad month. He keeps vinegar rags in a travel chest, because precaution is now a craft. The London bellman's cousin stands a night watch at a parish barrier with a lantern and the list, reading names with a care that keeps tempers civil. Myth, trimmed and tagged. Beaked masks, leather cones stuffed with herbs belong to later centuries and a few regions. They are theatre and tall at once, but not the essence. The essence is the river of paper, passes, permits, posted lists, printed bills, fines, receipts. Pastors pray, processions comfort. What moves numbers is spacing, timing, washing, airing, and paying. When people say medievals believed in miasma, here also and they invented quarantine. Tie borders too many, says Stakesland. A sealed gate without a granary is a riot by evening. A lazaretto without a budget is a rumour with a wall. City councils learn to feed the edges first. Watchmen, pest house nurses, grave diggers, scavenger boats. They pay with coin, not promises, because unpaid guards open doors. On the other side, Merchants learn to price delay. A week at anchor costs X. A clean bill is worth Y. A forged stamp risks everything. Markets internalize the calendar. Numbers again, modest and useful. 1 day lost at a city gate costs a mule train a second day down the road. Travelers learn to leave at dawn, when passes are checked with fresh eyes. To meetings a week for the health board, keep lazaretto yards from overflowing. 1 lantern every 2 posts on a cordon keeps the night from inventing shortcuts. Arithmetic becomes a kind of mercy. Seen Marçal, a later generation, because the lesson had to be relearned. A ship arrives with papers that look clean and cargo that smells wrong. Some men argue for a shortcut, some insist on the old 40 days. Where procedure fails, the city pays with graves. Where procedure holds, the harbour grumbles but breathes. Our hour is not about blame, it is about how easily institutions forget why they were born. Bring the bellman's logic to the border. A weekly habit of numbers in London teaches other cities to think in intervals. Bills of health at sea mirror bills of mortality on land. Both say, act on this page, not on a shout. The weaver's granddaughter reads her father's pass at a gate and understands in her bones what her grandfather learned with wages. Dignity begins when rules are posted and enforced evenly. Terms again, to last ones for this chapter. Sanitation in these years means drainage and airmen clear gutters and lift shutters, women air linen. Both have lists of when. Immunity zone, the boundary around a shrine or a bank where violence costs double expanded in plague years to protect grain lines and lazaretto ferries. Protection is logistics with a conscience. 1 correction to the romantic picture. Grand processions, miracle tales, saints' bones, these mattered to spirits. What mattered to numbers were smaller devotions. Vinegar on hands, cordon post staffed, passage checked at dawn not dusk, bills read on Friday, drains cleared on Monday. No hero carries this, clerks and porters do. If you want a statue, carve a man with an hourglass and a list. Why this matters tomorrow. Modern states grew shoulders where cities learn to carry fear. Boards of health, harbour masters with stamps, road watches with schedules. None of these cured plague. All of them turned panic into work. The quiet miracle is that the work can be taught, inherited, and audited. That is how a century of bad weather becomes a class in keeping order. The 7th part. Faith tried to turn fear into ritual and sometimes into blame. When the first great wave rolled, churches filled, because there was nowhere else to put breath together. Processions walked, relics travelled, bells tolled, until rope burned palms. Prayer is a schedule when you have none, but the same crowds that steadied some cities tipped others, where priests and councils kept rules in step spacing, alms, and work piety behaved like policy, where rumour outran ritual, fires lit for the wrong reasons. Scene Avignon, 1348. The papal court smells of ink and vinegar. Letters arrive from towns where Jews are accused of poisoning wells. Pope Clement VI reads testimonies, hears physicians and jurists, and writes a bull that says, as clearly as those years could, Jews are dying too, they are not the cause. He grants sanctuary to the quarter near the Rhone. Some princes heed, others do not. In Strasbourg the following winter, officials burn the ghetto and erase a ledger's worth of lives. Our hour refuses to mistake panic for piety. Institutions matter because they speak louder than crowds if they are brave early. Terms, clean and careful. Confraternity scuola, brotherhood. Lay associations that fund candles, bread, pest house nursing, funerals, and sometimes schools piety that behaves like logistics. Chantry, an endowment for prayers that also keeps lamps lit and the poor fed on a schedule. Indulgence, remission of certain church penalties for acts of piety in plague seasons. It sometimes turns into crowd magnets. Good intent, bad spacing. Flagellants, lay penitents who travel in bands, whipping themselves in public councils often ban them because their parades move disease faster than mercy. Numbers that hold without spectacle. To loaves a week from a confraternity feed a dozen households. Through a quarantine, 1 nurse per 10 beds in a pest house keeps the place from turning into a storeroom of fear. A procession that packs thousands into 1 lane can turn a quiet month into a bad one. The scale of kindness matters as much as its source. Myth, trimmed and tagged. Medieval religion is not one thing. Some parishes locked doors and prayed alone, others opened treasuries and hired gravediggers at guild rates. Some towns scapegoated Jews and strangers, others defended them with posted decrees and armed watches. The record is mixed, the lesson is not. Leadership decides whether ritual steadies or harms. Seen St. Rocco and the Ledgers of Mercy in northern Italian cities. Devotion to San Rocco the pilgrim healer spreads after mid-century. Confraternities in his name keep lists. Who needs soup on Thursday? Which alley's drains fell first? Which pest house nurse shows up sober? An image on a chapel wall becomes a roster on a table. Our Venetian notary older in memory now would have approved. He believed in clauses that feed people on time. Bring our 3 lives through the nave and back to the street. The Flemish weaver tacks a small coin to a chapel board, insurance disguised as piety. If he falls ill, his wife can claim bread in his name. He also walks his family in a wide loop around any procession, nodding to the saints and choosing air. The London bellman stands outside a church porch on a Friday as a priest reads a list of names remembered, and then reads his bills. Between the 2 lists, the city makes one memory. A Venetian health scribe drafts an order for a festival day. Candles at windows, processions in wards. Not city with pest house carts have right of way at all hours. Ritual and schedule shake hands. Tie altars to granaries, so stakes land. A sermon that tells the rich to open their storehouses on even days does more than soothe, it moves grain. A bishop who orders benches set under an arcade for open-air markets saves a lane from becoming a rumor. A council that posts guards on the ghetto gate to protect rather than imprison turns fear toward order. None of this is theology, all of it is love with a time and place. Numbers again, modest and useful. 1 chapel endowment of 10 ducats can buy vinegar, oil, and wages to nurses through a bad month. A synagogue spared by decree preserves a trading street that feeds a dozen families who would have gone hungry. A hatred had one. A scheduled hour for mourners, in small groups 6 at a time. Every half hour keeps grief from becoming a crowd that breathes badly. A correction to the picture of fire, controlled burning clothes, straw, incense braziers was a ritual and a precaution. It moved air and gave hands a job. Great fires that save cities and memories shortcuts. London's later blaze rearranged streets. It did not abolish plague by itself. The practices that mattered were smaller and less cinematic. Airing cloth, spacing bodies, washing thresholds, paying nurses in coin, and defending minorities on the record when rumours snarled. Seen Strasbourg's market after the burning, because silences count. Stalls stand where a quarter stood. A clerk draws a line through unpaid debts, because the debtors are ash. A baker learns to buy salt from someone who speaks different vowels. A child asks why candles burn in a window every Friday. An old woman says, "So we remember," and does not explain further. Violence rewrites supply chains and prayers. It also leaves a stain that honest ledgers do not let dry. Bring devotion back to procedure so the path stays true. City councils partner with confraternities. The brotherhood keeps the roster, the council pays the bread, the priest blesses the hands that carry it. Orders go out. No mass indoors, larger than 30 processions, to split by ward, flags lowered at cross lanes to keep flow. A sacristan chalks the doorjamb, where parish alms will be stacked at dawn. A health scribe schedules the cart, a bellman reads the hour. When fear wears vestments and the docket, it behaves. Numbers. Last this chapter. To holy days moved outdoors each month. Save a dozen funerals the week after. 3 watches paid on time at the ghetto gates by a quiet night where rumour wanted a fire. 1 posted decree quoting a pope's bull calms a market faster than a sermon alone. Even in ages we call faith-filled, paper and coin decide whether piety keeps breath or spends it. 1 last image before the coda. Late light lies on a nave floor at long bars. A woman ties a coin in a cloth and fastens it to a board for the poor. A cantor hums a line that is older than the plague and kinder than fear outside. A clerk pins a decree that names Jews as neighbours and forbids harm farther along the lane. A boy sets a brazier to smoke the pest house bedding. The city prays with its lungs and its lists. Why this matters tomorrow. Rituals teach timing saves lives. If you want faith to help in a crisis, give it a roster and the budget. Defend the targeted on paper. Before the rumor reaches the square, make kindness a schedule. That is how devotion becomes a public good. The eighth part. Faith tried to turn fear into ritual and sometimes into blame. When the first great wave rolled, churches filled, because there was nowhere else to put breath together. Processions walked, relics traveled, bells tolled, until rope burned palms. Prayer is a schedule when you have none. But the same crowds that steadied some cities tipped others, where priests and councils kept rules in step spacing, alms, and work piety behaved like policy. Where rumor outran ritual, fires lit for the wrong reasons. Messina v. 1348. The papal court smells of ink and vinegar. Letters arrive from towns where Jews are accused of poisoning wells. Pope Clement VI reads testimonies, hears physicians and jurists, and writes a bull that says, as clearly as those years could, Jews are dying too, they are not the cause. He grants sanctuary to the quarter near the Rhine. Some princes heed, others do not. In Strasbourg the following winter, officials burn the ghetto and erase a ledger's worth of lives. Our refuses to mistake panic for piety. Institutions matter because they speak louder than crowds if they are brave early. Terms, clean and careful. Confraternity scuola, brotherhood, lay associations that fund candles, bread, pest house nursing, funerals, and sometimes schools piety that behaves like logistics, chantry, an endowment for prayers that also keeps lamps lit and the poor fed on a schedule. Indulgence, remission of certain church penalties for acts of piety in plague seasons. It sometimes turns into crowd magnets. Good intent, bad spacing. Flagellants, lay penitents who travel in bands, whipping themselves in public councils often ban them, because their parades move disease faster than mercy. Numbers that hold without spectacle. To loaves a week from a confraternity, feed a dozen households. Through a quarantine, one nurse per 10 beds in a pest house keeps the place from turning into a storeroom of fear. A procession that packs thousands into one lane can turn a quiet month into a bad one. The scale of kindness matters as much as its source. Myth, trimmed and tagged. Medieval religion is not one thing. Some parishes locked doors and prayed alone, others opened treasuries and hired gravediggers at guild rates. Some towns scapegoated Jews and strangers, others defended them with posted decrees and armed watches. The record is mixed, the lesson is not. Leadership decides whether ritual steadies or harms. Seen St. Rocco and the Ledgers of Mercy in northern Italian cities. Devotion to San Rocco the pilgrim healer spreads after mid-century. Confraternities in his name keep lists. Who needs soup on Thursday? Which alley's drains foul first? Which pest house nurse shows up sober? An image on a chapel wall becomes a roster on a table. Our Venetian notary older in memory now would have approved. He believed in clauses that feed people on time. Bring our 3 lives through the nave and back to the street. The Flemish weaver tacks a small coin to a chapel board, insurance disguised as piety. If he falls ill, his wife can claim bread in his name. He also walks his family in a wide loop around any procession, nodding to the saints and choosing air. The London bellman stands outside a church porch on a Friday as a priest reads a list of names remembered, and then reads his bills. Between the 2 lists the city makes one memory. A Venetian health scribe drafts an order for a festival day. Candles at windows, processions in wards. Not city with pest house carts have right of way at all hours. Ritual and schedule shake hands. Tie altars to granaries, so stakes land. A sermon that tells the rich to open their storehouses on even days does more than soothe, it moves grain. A bishop who orders benches set under an arcade for open-air markets saves a lane from becoming a rumor. A council that posts guards on the ghetto gate to protect rather than imprison turns fear toward order. None of this is theology, all of it is love with a time and place. Numbers again, modest and useful. 1 chapel endowment of 10 ducats can buy vinegar, oil, and wages 4 to nurses through a bad month. A synagogue spared by decree preserves a trading street that feeds a dozen families who would have gone hungry. A hatred had one. A scheduled hour for mourners, in small groups 6 at a time. Every half hour keeps grief from becoming a crowd that breathes badly. A correction to the picture of fire. Controlled burning clothes, straw, incense braziers was a ritual and a precaution. It moved air and gave hands a job. Great fires that save cities and memories shortcuts. London's later blaze rearranged streets. It did not abolish plague by itself. The practices that mattered were smaller and less cinematic. Airing cloth, spacing bodies, washing thresholds, paying nurses in coin, and defending minorities on the record when rumours snarled. Seen Strasbourg's market after the burning, because silences count. Stalls stand where a quarter stood. A clerk draws a line through unpaid debts, because the debtors are ash. A baker learns to buy salt from someone who speaks different vowels. A child asks why candles burn in a window every Friday. An old woman says, "So we remember," and does not explain further. Violence rewrites supply chains and prayers. It also leaves a stain that honest ledgers do not let dry. Bring devotion back to procedure so the path stays true. City councils partner with confraternities. The brotherhood keeps the roster, the council pays the bread, the priest blesses the hands that carry it. Orders go out. No mass indoors larger than 30 processions, to split by ward flags lowered at cross lanes to keep flow. A sacristan chalks the doorjamb, where parish alms will be stacked at dawn. A health scribe schedules the cart. A bellman reads the hour. When fear wears vestments and the docket, it behaves. Numbers. Last this chapter. To holy days moved outdoors each month. Save a dozen funerals the week after. 3 watches paid on time at the ghetto gates by a quiet night where rumour wanted a fire. 1 posted decree quoting a pope's bull calms a market faster than a sermon alone. Even in ages we call faith-filled, paper and coin decide whether piety keeps breath or spends it. 1 last image before the coda. Late light lies on a nave floor at long bars. A woman ties a coin in a cloth and fastens it to a board for the poor. A cantor hums a line that is older than the plague and kinder than fear outside. A clerk pins a decree that names Jews as neighbours and forbids harm farther along the lane. A boy sets a brazier to smoke the pest house bedding. The city prays with its lungs and its lists. Why this matters tomorrow. Rituals teach timing saves lives. If you want faith to help in a crisis, give it a roster and a budget. Defend the targeted on paper. Before the rumour reaches the square, make kindness a schedule. That is how devotion becomes a public good.